late you up last night, all of you. So I'm sure you're very sleep deprived, some of you. I can see slightly droopy faces across the audience. But I think this is definitely a momentous result, and says a lot about I think our society and the future of the US. I think is definitely something which we should be considering at the moment. So I'd like to thank you for our three panelists for coming along and sharing their thoughts on what the future holds in the US and what this election cycle says about the current state of democracy. So our first panelist is Dr. Dan Larsen, who is a fellow of history at Trinity College, Cambridge. His research interests focus on intelligence in the early 20th century. We have Dr. Bronwen Everill, a fellow of Caius College, again in Electoral History, whose research focuses on the relationship between Africa and the US since the 18th century. And we have Maha Atal, a PhD candidate in politics at the University of Cambridge, who actually studied undergraduate in the United States, I understand.
I'm from there.
Yeah, great. So, and did you get a chance? Did you vote?
Of course I did.
And so I feel we have a very qualified panel to share their thoughts on this amazing result. Great. So firstly, perhaps I'd like to start with asking how many of you in the audience thought Trump was going to win yesterday? Okay. And out of you, how many of you thought Trump was going to win 6 months ago? Okay. So how many of you thought Trump was going to win 2 months ago? How many of you thought Trump would win 1 week ago? Interesting. Okay. So there's clearly been a very rapid, it really taken us all by surprise, I think it's clear to say. And so perhaps I think the panel could start off with sharing their thoughts on what's happened this cycle. And perhaps they could share who they would have liked to win and what point they thought this Trump phenomenon was going to happen.
Do you want to go first? Or? I mean, okay. Right, my thoughts. I voted in New York for Hillary Clinton. I did some phone banking for her. I have backstory there. I worked for her first Senate campaign. So I was in the Clinton camp early. I guess I have sort of two reactions to this. First is that I guess American partisanship is much more deeply entrenched than I thought it was, in the sense that all year we have been hearing, both from people inside the Republican Party and from commentators, Donald Trump is not a typical Republican. Donald Trump espouses all these positions that are not conservative on trade or whatever. And yet, he won all the states that Republicans traditionally win, and then some ones that, maybe 2 or 3 that were a little more outlandish, but basically that map did not look that surprising to me in terms of the states he actually carried. And if you look at the exit polls, it's, we knew he was going to win non-college educated whites. The surprise was that he won a substantial number of college-educated white voters, so that effectively the traditional Republican coalition came home to the party, which suggests that despite everything that is, at odds between Trump's views and what we assume is the views of the Republican base, they vote the party line. And that, I guess, surprised me. The second thing is that, today I was thinking about stuff that I thought at a campaign management level the Clinton people got wrong. And I don't really feel like from a campaign perspective there was a major gaffe, a rally that went awry, a speech that I thought was terrible. It was despite everything with the Bernie Sanders supporters, a very smooth convention. I think that, and this is such a qualified candidate, I do think that if you had asked me 15 years ago whether the race barrier would be harder to break than the gender barrier, I would have told you yes, and I was wrong about that, and I think I didn't understand quite how deeply seated misogyny is in our politics. And that's kind of where I am in reaction to this right now.
I also voted for Hillary. I vote in New Jersey, so I'm not sure how much help it is, but and I guess my initial take is maybe to to try to like inject some hope into this from a historical perspective, which is that whenever we make huge leaps forward in terms of the quote-unquote culture wars, as we have done over the past 4 to 8 years, there is always a backlash, or as people are calling it online, a white lash in this particular case. Always. And so I don't think that this is particularly out of step with America's, past, or necessarily with its approach to issues of expanding rights over the course of the past two centuries. And I think also, there's a map circulating on the internet about, how millennials voted. And so I think there is some hope in terms of where the country will be in 20 years. I think the slight, so that's all very hopeful, and I'm sort of taking a historian's, let's not panic perspective. I think the one worrying factor is, of course, that this is Donald Trump we're talking about, and he now has the nuclear codes and all of our state secrets, and that's probably not a great thing. So, I'm not particularly happy about that, but I am, I guess, not particularly surprised that the amount of change that we've seen over the last 8 years has generated this kind of backlash.
Hi, I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. If you were very closely following the election, you might know that my district was a swing district in a red state, which as of an hour ago still had not been called by the networks, although I've crunched the numbers and it looks like Trump's going to win very narrowly. I suppose I have perhaps a slightly different perspective, because I consider myself a liberal in the European sense of the word and a centrist. I've been one of these people who splits their tickets, and so in Nebraska that usually means voting for Democrats, although I am technically registered a Republican, mostly so I can vote in Republican primaries and vote for the moderate in the Republican primaries, because they're the only ones that matter in Nebraska. I have voted on occasionally for Republican congressional candidates. You may recognize the name of Chuck Hagel, who was a who was a senator from Nebraska and served as Barack Obama's Secretary of Defense. Not that the Democrats actually put up anyone against him, but I was happy to vote for his re-election because I thought Chuck Hagel was a stand-up guy. I voted for Hillary Clinton this time around. I voted for Barack Obama 4 years ago. I voted for John McCain 4 years before that. But 4 years ago, I would have been disappointed to have lost that vote. In 2008, I was mildly disappointed, but also incredibly proud, and overall pretty happy with the result. This time round, this was a different election with a different candidate, and I think. My perspective has always been that it's people like me who get to decide the elections. Not me personally, but it's that it's politicians appealing to people like me who decide the elections in the United States. And that's why people like Hillary Clinton win primaries and not Bernie Sanders. It's why John McCain and Mitt Romney win primaries and not the parade of crazies that went against them 4 and 8 years ago. It's why we have a George W. Bush talking about compassionate conservatism in 2000. It's why we have John Kerry beating Howard Dean in 2004. And this time, the center failed. And I'm not sure how I feel about that.
For example, pick up on what Dan said. Why did you panelists think the centers failed, and what lies behind Trumpism?
I think they're two separate things. I think the center failed because I think a lot of people were quite uncomfortable with the gender issues raised by this campaign, or and not just latent misogyny, which I think is part of it, but also the question of American masculinity. And so I think that's why the center failed. I don't think that's why we saw the rise of Trump, though. I think that has to do with a combination of economic, racial, and cultural factors, says the historian. But yeah, I mean, I think that he appealed to a sort of coalition of different voters who were angry about different things, which helps to explain why he has no actual coherent policy and yet manages to win, because actually his outlandish statements appealed to a variety of people. But yeah.
But that, I think, is a little bit gendered. So I will say, I think the center failed because of the gender stuff in a couple of ways. I think all the stuff that you said is absolutely right, but I also think, Hillary Clinton is the kind of candidate actually in the mold of a lot of the centrist Democrats that you just named.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
This is, so that earlier in the year when there were people going, why isn't Biden running? And I'm going, exactly what, on a policy positions perspective, do you see that's different between Joe Biden's voting record and Hillary Clinton's policy record? That made no sense to me whatsoever, except that one of them is a man. And I think if part of the reason that the center holds in American politics is that the centrist candidates seem reasonable and normal and the people on the fringes seem a bit wacky and weird, we have a hard time looking at a woman and saying that is a reasonable person. And that's on us. I think that's sort of the first thing. But the other thing is that whatever everybody has character quirks, whatever her character quirks are, which are actually pretty mild, we perceive a mildly quirky woman as way out there, crazy cat lady kind of thing. And we perceive, even the most outlandish guy, and that is not just Trump, but Sanders with the hair and the shouting and whatever is a very, Larry David doesn't have to do that much hyperbole on top of that character to make it funny in SNL. And yet that is lovable uncle that you would like to have at Christmas. So I think, part of this is that the weirdness of Trump doesn't read as weird as it is next to a reasonable woman, because we have a really hard time processing this is a reasonable woman.
Yeah, and Trump is also a recognizable face from TV doing the thing that he was famous for doing on TV. And so people, I think maybe just read that as that's his TV character. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I don't know, one of the questions that I'm grappling with is whether the center ever existed, whether the center does exist. It may well be that this norm in American politics has been a myth, and that elections can be won without coming to the center. Ted Cruz earlier in the cycle was giving precisely this argument that Republicans could elect him and he could win because he wouldn't run to the center, he would just mobilize the base. And maybe he was right. Yeah.
And perhaps in the second part of that question, I know it's a big issue, and historians will be diagnosing this for the rest of history, I think, probably, but what is Trumpism to you firstly, and why did it happen?
Bro culture writ large.
I think there's a pollster's term that's roaming around now called authoritarian populism.
Yeah.
I guess that's what Trumpism is to me. It's the U.S. instantiation of that. And it's what we've seen on the rise in Europe for 15 years, maybe longer now. Longer. It's late 90s, I think, where Jörg Haider comes really, really close in Austria for the first time. And that's probably where I would date that mode of politics from. That mode of politics is in power in India now. So, I mean, it's part of an ideology that is on the rise across, both developed and emerging democracies. It didn't come out of nowhere. I think, it may be that this is a referendum on American exceptionalism in a way, in the sense that we actually are moving in a direction that maps very closely onto what comparable developed democracies are doing. And that's not the way that we like to think about ourselves.
I'm skeptical of arguments that this is like the globalized left behind, massing behind Donald Trump. I don't think that actually correctly assesses it, but I do think that in that one regard, so that one aspect of his appeal, I think that's where he overlaps with all of the rest of the sort of this authoritarian populism. I mean, I would also draw a line. This is going on YouTube. Maybe I won't draw a line, but between a certain other group in the Middle East causing a lot of havoc, and the same kind of impulse in America. So, I mean, it's that part of it, I think, is a reaction to, a perception of globalized economics and globalized Western values, which I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with, even in the West.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, and I think it's also important not to disconnect the not to disconnect the phenomenon of Trumpism from Trump himself. From Trump himself, he was. If you're a proper political junkie, you may have heard of Scott Adams, the Dilbert cartoon creator, who put forward the notion that Donald Trump was a master persuader. I don't agree with that thesis, just because there's been so many counter examples of it. But I do think there is a nugget of truth there, and that the man has very strong instincts of persuasion. I don't think it's calculated, but he is a showman, and he has put on a good show in an entertaining, horrifying kind of way. He also has a message that, despite its paranoia, can resonate. I don't know if people saw his final 2-minute ad that he put out in the last few days. That was his sort of closing argument for America. I think that's how they entitled it. And it's actually, as a piece of political advertising, it's a really good ad. It taps into some kind of disturbing anti-Semitic tropes, and that kind of thing. But yeah, it is a powerful ad with delivered charismatically by a man who has some pretty decent persuasive abilities, or persuasive instincts, I should say, because I don't think he's much more than an instinctual man, but...
What are your thoughts on the comparison people are going to draw between Brexit and the rise of Trump?
I think the parallels are mostly in its unexpectedness, but I think actually the party lines argument is a strong one against the parallels. I think there were a lot of people who saw this as a choice between two bad options, and were just happy to vote party line as a result, or not vote. And I think that because it's not a referendum question. It's about a candidate for a particular party. That's gonna generate a difference. And I think a lot of that party line stuff is more cultural than maybe a lot of people have been making the case for why Brexit happened here. I'm not sure. And the Supreme Court is one of the big ones for that. And I know a lot of Republicans who were reluctant to vote for Trump, but did it because they were concerned about the Supreme Court vacancy and the predicted upcoming Supreme Court vacancies.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think that the causes of Brexit were more diverse but intertwined. So I think there is an economic component, there is a racial component, there is a kind of growing anti-truth politics piece of it. I think that, a lot of those things are there in the American election, but there isn't anything in Brexit that is comparable to the sort of shock to the system of American politics that was the election of Obama. And the fact that much of what is coming home to roost here is that there is a portion of the American population that even after losing that election did not regard him as the legitimate president. Donald Trump's political career is built on creating a movement to foster the belief in American society that Barack Obama is not the real president. And so, that's a pretty direct thread, and there isn't anything in the run-up to Brexit like that.
Yeah.
So you don't buy that argument?
No. I said I don't know. I think certainly there are some superficial similarities. The movement of white working class, I think, tracks in both, even if in a Brexit or in a British political context that they're happy to vote for Brexit and yet still stay behind a Labour leader, whereas not quite so much in the US. But I really don't know. I'm gonna have to. I've got a lot of thinking to do over the next little while.
I don't know if that movement's new, though, in either case. I think the Labour Party has been slowly losing its share of those voters for some time. By some time, a decade or something. But the Democrats have been losing those voters since the Civil Rights Movement, basically. And James Surowiecki, who is the finance correspondent for The New Yorker, has been very, very good on Twitter this year in terms of actually going and finding particular neighborhoods where, journalists were going and interviewing Trump voters, white working class, unionized Trump voters who saw their jobs, disappear because of some trade agreement or whatever. And those are neighborhoods that have gone for Republican candidates on what appear to be basically racial grounds since the 60s. So I don't know how much movement there actually is, and how much of it was the Democrats only ever carried those voters when the Democrats were talking about a working class politics that benefited whites and only whites.
Before we look forward to perhaps what the future holds for you, so I'd love some questions on digesting what is taking place and this election cycle.
Can I just ask on that last question? Do you not see some sort of anti-establishment vote in both those cases? Is that, none of you really touched on that idea that Hillary was in many senses embodied the establishment, and in the same way that the sort of Remain vote in the UK was the establishment vote, and there's a lot of backlash against that. Is that not something you think played a role in both or either of them?
I can see it, but I am confused by how the voting population comes to that conclusion, and how we get to a place where a billionaire real estate mogul who built his real estate empire on money that he inherited from his father's real estate empire is the anti-establishment candidate, and a woman running for an office that a woman has never held is the establishment candidate. Something is very, very deeply wrong with our understanding of what is the establishment if that's the way that voters are thinking about it. I think that may be the way that voters are thinking about it, but I think that bears very little relationship to facts. Whereas in the Brexit case, I can understand that support for the European Union does seem to be, overlapping with people who are parts of demographics that I would consider to be established centers of power in British life. So to me, it just feels like that is a different thing.
I think it played a role in making people see it as a choice between two evils. I think a lot of that was about not wanting to return to what people remember as the gridlock of Clinton's administration. I think there was a moment after Clinton left office that people remembered the 90s with nostalgia. But I think we've moved beyond that point now, and now everybody's, remembering. Trump's campaign did do a good job of dredging up memories of Paula Jones and Monica Lewinsky and, all of the obstructionism again. And so I think there was a concern, and again, after a second Bush presidency of yet another Clinton presidency, which is, I think, one of the reasons Jeb had no hope in the primaries, the Republican primaries, because no one wanted to see a Bush versus Clinton election. So yeah, I think I'm not sure it was established. I think it was establishment in a sort of dynastic way, rather than maybe establishment in a this person has had everything handed to them kind of way. But what I struggle with there is how to get over that, because there are so few women in high-level American politics that I just can't see where a anti-establishment female candidate is gonna come from.
This is where you get to the cat lady thing.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
An anti-establishment female candidate wouldn't make it out of the Iowa caucus.
No. So I don't know what I guess I can see how she would be perceived as establishment, but I don't know how to combat that in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're right. Every institution of the establishment leaned in against him. The Omaha World Herald has not endorsed a Democratic presidential candidate since 1932, and they endorsed Hillary Clinton. We saw this in every newspaper endorsement, and the lesson is newspaper endorsements don't matter. We saw this. And certainly, I think there is a growing burn it down attitude in this country about Westminster, and to a lesser extent Brussels. And the United States towards Washington, and it's been very disturbing watching all of these norms of American democracy and just go up in flames and not extract a major political price.
What exactly in the 8 years of Obama's administration elected us? Do you feel like there's been any build-up towards that?
But the Tea Party basically emerged, as you said, it's about not recognizing this as a legitimate presidency to a certain extent. That's a minority. I don't think that's everybody's position, but there has been a lot of cultural change as a result, and I think because Congress was so obstructionist, Obama was driven to do some things by executive action, and that just further fuels speculation that this is a imperial presidency or whatever, and that makes people even angrier about the thing that they were already angry about. But I do think it's also been a time of rapid social change. I mean, the difference in American acceptance of LGBTQ rights between 2003 and 2013 is just insane. Like, and insane in a good way.
Yeah.
Obviously. But probably, yeah, some of this is a reaction to the speed of that transition. Lots of people need time to bed down to cultural change, and that was a speedy cultural change, and there's a lot of backlash against that.
I also think, the Tea Party victory in Congress in 2010 basically set up a dynamic for the rest of the Obama presidency in which there was a lot of gridlock. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is people are angry that he's doing stuff by executive action, but I think mostly people are not paying attention to that. They just do not like to see the gridlock. I think this is much, much worse than anything that happened in the 90s. In terms of the degree to which it is now the policy of the opposition in Congress that we just don't, we don't even pretend to be thinking about cooperating, right? That's just not what we're doing. So, I think that has built up a sort of head of antagonism that was going to release itself in something like this. So I do think it's also a reaction to the way that the process of governance is taking place.
But it's cyclical, right? So the process of governance comes to
a
halt in order to reinforce this image that governance doesn't work. Yeah. I mean, because ultimately one of the arguments is, that government doesn't work, and so it should just get out of everybody's life except in certain cultural
right, where it's legitimate to be very invasive.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the U.S. Congress went through quite a rapid period of change between 2006 and 2011, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because we had a wave election in 2006 that threw out all of the blue state Republicans, and then we had a wave election in 2010 that threw out most of the red state Democrats, and Congress has been far more polarized as a consequence, and I don't lay. I admire what Obama tried to do especially in his first 2 years. But I also think that that in some ways, to take a counterfactual, if John McCain had been elected president in 2008, we would not have Donald Trump today. I think that is clear. And
you might have Sarah Palin. We would definitely have Sarah Palin. It would just be in one capacity.
Yeah. No, true. And that's certainly not something I defend or. I think that was probably his worst action of a man I otherwise have more or less a high degree of respect for at many times. But Obama had large majorities in the House. He had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, and he tried to govern with it. Elections have consequences, and I don't blame him for trying to do that. And I have a few quibbles with a few parts of the Affordable Care Act, but I think by and large, it was a positive thing, but politically, persisting with that act was it required a great deal of political courage, but And whether the backlash against it was reasonable, and I think in a large degree it wasn't, but regardless of whether it was reasonable, deciding to forge ahead with an unpopular bill that had major consequences, had major political consequences. And I mean, it's a reasonable position to say it was worth it, but I mean, it's set up 2010.
I mean, just to play devil's advocate
Sure.
to myself and to you for a minute. Like, I mean, just Sarah Palin was on the radar before he was elected and represented this same brand, I think, of conservatism or whatever Trump represents. And so I think actually we could see this not being necessarily a consequence of Obama's election, but a consequence of Obama's candidacy, even. And then he reacted by driving this through because he knew what was coming in 2010. He knew that he had this majority, and he knew it was going to be temporary because he saw the writing on the wall with Sarah Palin and the rise of the Tea Party, and so just did it to get it done before he didn't have an option anymore.
They knew when they lost the special election in Massachusetts
Yeah.
that it was coming. So if people remember, Senator Ted Kennedy passed away very shortly after Obama was elected, and so that seat was open and being contested while the Obamacare bill was being debated. And when that seat, Ted Kennedy's seat in Massachusetts, was won by a Republican, on "if you elect me, I will stop Obamacare," that was the moment that they realized they were going to have to ram through whatever they could get. And at that point, what had up to that time looked like it might be a coherent package of economic reforms just got completely gutted. And it's a much, much weaker bill as a consequence of that. But that's why they knew it was coming, because of the Scott Brown thing.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, I also... I don't necessarily agree that it was inevitable. I mean, I do think that incumbent parties lose seats in midterms,
right.
and that's what happens. And but I mean, the scale of the wave in 2010.
No.
I mean, I can't disconnect that from the way in which Obama governed in his first 2 years, regardless of and that's not to say that the way he governed was irresponsible or that he was doing something wrong in a policy sense, but in a political sense, it was a reaction to the decisions that were made in those 2 years, and certainly, I mean, I think it would have been smaller, and maybe it was worth it, but I mean, it had political consequences.
Let me give you something to respond to without any of the explanations you've offered, and go to the electoral system itself, or the way electoral systems work. The American way is to have these two huge options and 4 or 5% at most on the other at the end for somebody else. So it's like a Brexit referendum in that sense, to follow up the point over here. And American presidential elections are always relatively close. I mean, the number that haven't been close are very few. And so when I say close, I'm thinking 4% or so. And so then we come to the FBI and a pivotal moment when things are sitting in balance as the debate is moving. And the last 10 days are always, in close elections, pivotal, because that's when the vote starts to break. And the very moment in that election campaign, down comes the FBI red herring, or whatever you want to call it, intervention. Why not simply say it's an accident as simple as that? It's the electoral system that suddenly moves significant numbers of people on the very issue that Trump is hitting Hillary on, and the trend is therefore a 4%, 5% turn. And there it is.
So, okay, I have a few thoughts, and then Dan, I'd actually love to hear your thoughts on this because this is an intelligent thing. But so the electoral system makes for close elections that way. I think that's true. This was actually, if for a second you imagine that you have a person with Hillary Clinton's policy record and persona, who is not a woman, running, this was one of those rare elections that was not going to be close. A Mr. Hillary Clinton running against Donald Trump was going to be one of those rare landslides. It was close because of that. So I do think the stuff we've been discussing is the reason that this was normal between two candidates who are not similar in a normal way. But then I think the swing, I do think it is substantially Mike Hunt, and I don't know anything about really what was happening inside, but just kind of from making, I won't say I was making phone calls for Clinton all the way through, but quite intensively in the last week, and in the states where it was close, and in some of the ones that she ended up not winning, you were getting trustworthiness questions, and I hadn't been getting those for a few weeks before that. I had been getting questions about, I'm really concerned about Trump, and I don't want him to come in, and stuff about his character and women, and the types of questions you were getting back shifted very quickly in that last week, and I think a lot of that is down to the letter. But this is about intelligence, and maybe the intelligence expert should weigh in.
No, well, I mean, this is, I woke up on that Saturday morning and swore very loudly. Because, just from the very limited facts as they were initially presented, it didn't seem like this was anything substantive, apart from the speculation that the FBI director wouldn't have done this if it wasn't a big deal, which I do think hurt her to a considerable extent, and then by the time that cloud got lifted, it was too late. According to the exit poll, something like 14% of voters made up their minds in the last week or the last few days. And I don't think that event can be disconnected from that. I do think that it does tie into significant political problems that she was having, or that she has always had on that issue, fairly or unfairly, but she has had honesty and trustworthiness problems for a long time. And I think a lot of that is probably because of, how did a friend of mine put it, Republicans rubbing sticks under her chair and then declaring where there's smoke, there's fire. I don't know. I agree to a considerable extent with what you say about her as a female candidate, but I also think that in a lot of respects, she was a pretty lousy candidate. I think she was a very good potential president. But in a lot of ways, she was a lousy candidate. Her unfavorable numbers were high, have always been high. And, you might be right that that's connected to her gender, but she's had problems with honesty and trustworthiness, with this idea of scandal and corruption. and which her primary opponent fed into that narrative quite heavily earlier on in the year, and then to have it blow up again in such a big way after it had finally seemed to die down, but to bring it back into the voters' consciousness, not just this particular thing, but just this idea of taint, an idea of corruption and scandal that had been latent in voters' minds for decades, rightly or wrongly, probably mostly the latter. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a really close election, and in really close elections, everything swings it.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know, the third party swung it, the letter swung it, everything swings it. But, you know, I mean, as you say.
But I think it does tap in. I mean, I think the letter and Trump's handling of it taps into, again, longer term issues about what Trumpism is, because his base doesn't have a problem with conspiracy theories. And there may be deeper issues, I'm not exactly sure how to quantify them or explain them, but about education and economic advantage and cultural capital, to do with his explanation of how the FBI could not have possibly gone through that many emails in that number of hours. I mean, that just lacks a basic understanding of how computers work and how search terms work, but it doesn't lack a basic understanding of how his voters use email, maybe. Yeah. So I think, he could be very clever about that, or he could just be reflecting his own experience of not using email. But I think it's not unrelated to what created Trumpism in the first place, I think.
I mean, I'm keen to push that discussion onwards to looking forward. What is next for the United States, and what is next for the world in terms of what you see U.S. foreign policy being?
That's you.
Well, I mean, I think there's a scale of these things. So I think we either have, on the good end of the spectrum, Mike Pence bad, which is a scenario in which, I think Donald Trump is fundamentally a narcissist and is fundamentally someone who doesn't care about anything other than public adoration. And I think he has fantasized about two moments in the future, one being his victory speech last night, the other being his inauguration in January. And I don't think he has really thought in a serious way about anything after that. So the question is, to what extent he will be controlled and managed by a group of people who...
The establishment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a group of people I'm not particularly keen on in the first place, but the extent to which people like Mike Pence, people like his children, his daughter and his son-in-law are going to be quite possibly the two most important figures for the next 4 years in terms of being the people that he listens to, because he doesn't listen to many people.
And whoever's in charge of his Twitter account.
Yeah. When it's not him.
Or wait till he finds out you can't use your personal cell phone in government.
Yeah.
So, and in that sort of spectrum, we end up with a pretty right wing, but normal-ish kind of policy. And then on the far other end of the spectrum is we have a man who feels emboldened by the results rather than overawed by the sense of responsibility, who feels as though everything that he has said has been vindicated, that his abilities have been vindicated, and that he can do this job no problem. In which case, and we are in for a pretty rough next 4 years.
I would put in there a person who is often lumped in with the normal Republican right that we now, I guess, have to cross our fingers and hope is able to rein him in some way, but who actually would facilitate the much more dramatically violent version of the next 4 years is Giuliani. I don't think Giuliani actually goes in the normal camp. I think when the Giuliani handling of security in New York during his tenure, writ large as a global foreign policy agenda, is way on the far side of bad. And the fact that he's been the most consistent Trump surrogate the whole time.
Yeah. But they want him as Attorney General, which is even more terrifying.
Yeah. But so, I mean, that is the person that I was really scared to see on my TV last night. Yeah, I'm not over that period and what happened in my city in those years. So.
Okay, perhaps we don't actually have any specific foreign policy ideas, but then does the panel have any ideas about, in any policy, what one Trump government is going to look like?
Yeah, I do. I was thinking about this today. I haven't looked at the specific people who have been elected to Congress, so somebody in the audience tell me if I'm wrong. But I am assuming that he is getting a Republican Congress composed mostly of normal Republicans. Which means he's going to have to find something to do in his first 2 years that falls in the little bit of the Venn diagram where he overlaps with them. Which means I think the first thing is going to be they repeal Obamacare.
Yeah.
Which would suck, but not suck anywhere near as much as all the other stuff that I'm worried about. So that, I think. I think that some of the stuff on illegal immigration they're going to go for, because that might be an overlap area. I'm trying to think what else,
Environment.
Yeah, I think all the executive actions that Obama's taken on the environment, you could see immediately reversed. So if I was trying to strategize out of the enormous torrent of weird stuff that he's said since he started running, which of these things are you going to go for? You need to find the things that look like they could plausibly be sold to the Republican Party we thought we had 2 years ago. And that's, where I would go. And I suppose, the nomination of Merrick Garland is automatically withdrawn, and they put up somebody probably quite scary for that Supreme Court seat.
Yeah. Getting back to your idea of foreign policy, on the far end of the spectrum, we could see the entire collapse of the post-war order that has been the bedrock of both parties' foreign policies for the last
70
years. And that's a distinct possibility if he carries through on a lot of the things that he said he will. I think there's a lot of Republicans in Congress who are not keen on that idea. But foreign policy is the place where the president reigns almost supreme. It would really take a real bipartisan coalition to attempt to impose a congressionally mandated foreign policy on the president is difficult to impossible. And I don't know. One other thing I'm really worried about is, we have seen how the man reacts to when he has been challenged and when things have gone wrong. And what he would attempt to do in response to those kinds of institutional challenges posed by Congress or the Supreme Court or other bodies concerns me a great deal.
In terms of domestic responses to Trump's presidency, I think there will be a lot of coalition building and things like Black Lives Matter. The Dakota Access Pipeline will now probably shut down because Democrats will all pile on. A lot of people were holding back because they saw, maybe there's room for middle ground. Maybe we can, give Obama a pass on this, or give future President Clinton a pass on this. I think now people will jump on board those social movements as a sort of protest response to Trump's presidency. So that could be good, maybe, depending how you see those things.
One thing we also haven't talked about that I want to bring up is the topic of race, because I don't think we've touched on that near enough. It's been the racial dynamics of this election have been really disturbing. I mean, I've seen charges of racism flung against Republicans in previous elections, and never really, maybe a little in undercurrents, but never really bought it in the same sort of way. But the candidacy that we have had has been very much appealing to an America that I thought the country had moved past, where racial identity becomes more important and not less. Just the way in which certain elements of the white vote moved, the giving up in the Republican Party on any idea of appealing to Hispanic voters or trying to pick off, just the notion that, because whatever you want to think about George Bush in 2004, he did make a play and got quite a lot of the Hispanic vote. He did make a play for and did get the African American vote. But to have a politics in which that's not seen as desirable or something that needs to be appealed to by one of the two major political parties, deeply concerns and distresses me.
I think that's something that's been playing out inside the Republican Party for, 45, 50 years. From the moment that, kind of white voters who are opposed to civil rights walk out of the Democratic Party in the 60s. And the Republican Party makes a conscious choice at that moment that this is going to be a strategy, right? This is Nixon's Southern strategy. And from that moment onwards, there is a tension inside the Republican Party between people who are very uncomfortable with this, who see that for a traditional Republican Party, actually, Latino voters are a huge vote base that could be open to them if you're interested in voters who are church-going, who are socially conservative, who are, broadly speaking, fiscally moderate. There was a vote base there. And that debate is taking place all the way through in the party and kind of even from year to year. There are years, if you go back through the Republican presidential candidates that seem more Southern strategy to me than others. The Obama election, threw that competition way over to one side of the dial. I think that's so I don't think it came out of nowhere. I think it's been a debate inside the party and very specifically inside the GOP. For a while. It was like an arm wrestling thing that was pretty even, and the Obama election just turned it all the way over onto one side. But it was threatening to go that way for a long time.
Yeah. It's a move away from any kind of coalition building, and towards, identity politics at its most extreme form, right? That, if you vote for that person, then you're voting based on this race or this gender, and if you vote for this person, then you're voting based on this race or this gender. I think it's a problem with identity politics as a thing generally, because because this is the kind of backlash that you get from that. But I think, as I was saying before, I think the sort of dog whistling that was going on with the Sarah Palin choice made it clear that this was going to be what the opposition was about from, August 2008. And so it's not surprising that this is what the opposition is about. I think I am only slightly reluctant to pin this all on race, because if you pin it all on race, then there's no explanation for Obama's second term. And so, I think there has to be some kind of there has to be some kind of gender issue in there. There has to be, a globalization issue, although not as much as I think the media is going to pick up on. And I think, I don't know. What I actually want to throw out is Christian conservatism. I think that we can just, that doesn't actually mean anything.
But we should toss it up for debate. I think there is a little bit of, something. There's something there, I think. I follow what remains of progressive Christianity in the U.S. That used to be a very organized force inside the American left, but really it's been on the decline for a long time. And there has been a lot of talk about, churches, like local churches that people go to that have long histories of marching for civil rights or being, very involved in, advocating for social housing in the 1920s, that have just worked really hard right in the last 20 years. And to the extent that one of the ways that people who otherwise aren't, they don't vote in every local election, they don't necessarily follow politics all the time, one of the forms of political engagement that people have every day in their communities are the religious organizations that they're part of. And if those community organizations lurch very dramatically in one direction, then I don't think we should be that surprised that that's where the country's politics eventually go.
But I think it's just interesting that the things that we thought conservative Christians cared about, they do not at all.
I think you put abortion versus choice in this issue, particularly now with the appointment of a new Supreme Court justice.
Sure, and from a perspective of, again, that Supreme Court justice question, yes. But from Trump's personal record on what he's said about this, no, not at all. Like, they don't, it's not, and I think this comes down to a hope that Trump will act as a puppet of the Republican Party, and so then, they'll get through a traditional conservative judge. But what that's based on doesn't seem. It doesn't seem to be. The campaign.
Only one of these candidates is a practicing church-going Christian, and that candidate was not Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton is a very devout Methodist who is quoting Wesley all the time in her speeches, and evangelical Christianity didn't vote for her. I am now going to skeptical face a lot of the things that they say they're voting about.
Black evangelical Christianity may have.
Yes. That's true.
And basically all I'm saying is Christianity is just purely political, and we should throw it out as like a, I don't know, as a sort of value marker. It is what people want it to be, I think.
You guys got on a roll there. This question would have come up, I think, possibly a bit more useful earlier. But so I empathize with what I think is pain in the middle, and that I think there's a great deal of audacity for us to sit here, and I say this as an American, but to sit here and quiz them and make them account for what went wrong, and not ourselves ask. I think the most upsetting thing about the election last night was, unsurprisingly, in my own college, a maudlin undergrad, a group, coming in with Trump gear they bought. And for a while, until 4 a.m., laughing about it and making pro-Trump chants. So I think the Academy has, and this is for the group, this is geared at this, what you identified as motivating activism, but the Academy has something to answer for. And I think what are we going to do? Because this is not limited to the US, this is not limited to Britain, and I think we have not done enough. And it's very easy for us to sit here and say this was the working class and to look down our noses, and that is clearly not the case. So I think that question is too big to ask you to answer, but I think this room, I hope this room will consider that. And
I think actually your point about it always being a sort of narrow margin is valuable to bear in mind, because I think it's that margin that we can sway in any given election year, and it's that margin that we can sort of push forward being progressive. The reason I worry about the economic narrative of Brexit and of Trumpism is because I worry that it lays all the blame at the foot of globalization and says, if only we could improve these people's lives, they would think like us. Which is, ideological chauvinism at its best, right? I would love it if everyone thought like me, but I have to acknowledge that people have their own reasons for thinking their own ways. And I don't believe in everybody is entitled to their opinion, because some opinions are terrible for the world. But I do believe that people are not all going to think like me if only they had more information, or if only they had a better education, or if only they had more money. And so I agree with you that there is some that we can do, but I think it's at that margin, and I don't think it's going to ever be a case of, we will get rid of all white supremacists ever by just, doing more university outreach or something. So yeah, I agree. There is stuff that we can do, and I'm, I was right on there early morning Twitter saying let's not give up, people. Don't collapse in despair like we did in 2000 or 2004 or whatever. The Tea Party showed us how to do an effective opposition. If you want to be really oppositional, so maybe we should take a page from their playbook. I don't know, but I don't think we're ever going to do more than move the margin.
What do you think about the fact that in the U.S. you can win an election without winning the popular vote?
I think it's hurt us twice now, but it's
in
very
recent times.
Well, yeah. In very recent times, it's hurt us personally twice now. But I don't know. I agree with the founders' reasoning for it, for exactly the sort of scary populist things that we've just seen. It's just that, unfortunately, then it got tied to the popular vote, and then, it's just sort of, yeah.
Yeah, on Monday, or a year ago, I would have given you a reasonably impassioned defense of the Electoral College. I would have argued that it was a structural constraint that promoted moderation, that forced candidates to look away from their bases, to look to swing voters in swing states who are moderate people, who are centrists, who would reject extremism. And tonight?
That's what it is supposed to do.
Yeah.
That is it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
That's what it's designed to do. But
I also just think there's not a lot of good in elections are fought within the rules that are set for that particular election. And both sides knew going into this what the rules of the American electoral system, were, and Hillary Clinton lost on those terms. So there is a part of me that is just sort of, kind of where Caitlin is in her question, which is to say, we lost this thing. Now we need to figure out what we're doing, and not just in the U.S., but globally, how we move forward from here. And one thing I will say, I am in the politics faculty. I do a little bit of undergraduate teaching, and maybe you guys can speak to what it's like in history, but those of us who are in departments where what we study and teach is very intimately related to what is going on out there in the world, I think do a very poor job of engaging with that. And I don't just mean like policy relevant research. I mean, I teach undergraduates, and we have topics for essays that are very close to stuff that's in the news. And it's a better essay if it doesn't go there. If it's deeply theoretical. If it's, I think we almost encourage a kind of what it means to be a serious intellectual is to have a sort of glib detachment from the human stakes of what is happening. And one of the reasons that moment in a bar was so hurtful is that there were people in the room watching for whom the election of Trump is a life and death kind of thing. For people that are close to them. I mean, if he goes for the immigration, if he goes, for the watch list of Muslim Americans, whatever, all the really draconian stuff that's been in the campaign, and to have people come in there and go, I'm, so savvy and so Cambridge that this is funny to me, I think was really very dissonant. But I think that part of the way in which we teach the social sciences reproduces that. And we are accountable for that, I think.
I mean, I think in history, the motivation behind that is more to try to get people to move away from thinking that they're better than the past. And so that does require sort of maybe pushing out some of the activism that you find in essays, because you're trying to move people away from, declaring their activism over dead people. And that can move you away from activism. But I don't think it doesn't have to. It's just, if you're choosing to study history, you shouldn't think you're better than people in the past. You should, you can recognize parallels or whatever.
But somehow I think that's not.
But that doesn't necessarily.
That's not communicating.
Yeah.
And what I think we should think about, and I don't think this is Cambridge specific. I think this is something I've observed, in the teaching of social science at a number of elite universities. But it is something we have to think about, because it shouldn't have that effect, but I think it does. And I don't know why, and we should probably go away and think about that.
Another question? Yeah. So I guess it's not really a question, it's kind of summarizing some ideas you've already covered. But I was wondering if you could sort of paint a picture of it's kind of two questions. One, of the candidate who could or would have beaten Trump, both in terms of their policies and then also in terms of their personal attributes, gender, etc. And then which of those two do you think would have been more important? Presuming that you can think of a candidate who could beat Trump.
Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, part of me, I recognize all the things that we've said, but part of me is also aware that it's very rare now for a party to stay in the White House for 3 terms, and that that it is also pretty typical for outgoing president to have high favorables and to be seen as sort of by their own party as being the only person who would have beat this now incoming other party. So yeah, pragmatically, I think from a who Democrats would have rallied behind Obama again. I don't know. Yeah,
I still think a relatively center-left Democrat who was not Hillary Clinton would have won this race. And I think part of was not Hillary Clinton is gender. Part of it is, that she has this long history, and some of that counts against her and some of it counts for her, but there was a lot there to go after. But yeah, I think a Joe Biden would have won this race, but I don't think that's, I was in a discussion in my department today and somebody said, well, because of that, it means she was the wrong candidate. And I think, if we're the kind of country where there's such a difference in our perception of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden that she loses this race and he wins it, that's not on the Democratic Party for selecting her, and it's not on her, it's on us.
yeah.
No, I agree with that. But yeah, I mean, as I said before, it was so close that anything would have tipped it. And I think not being Hillary Clinton could well have just been, I mean, all she needed was another 1.5 in a couple of these swing states. So
No.
No. And you can, a good way to think about that actually is to go look at the map of the states she won, right? Would he have won all of the same states? I think probably actually he would have won the states that she won. Look at the states she didn't win that she needed to win at the end to close the deal. Michigan is the only one of the states she didn't win that she needed to win that he probably would have won. North Carolina? No way, because for a Democrat to win North Carolina, you needed to carry huge numbers of African American turnout by enormous margins, and at no point in the primary did Bernie Sanders carry basically any African American voters. And that has almost everything to do with basically his position on guns. Yeah. So I mean that was totally self-inflicted. So no, I don't think there's any way in which that would have happened. And you could pick it apart state by state.
Yeah, and
Socialism. I mean, it was never gonna.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think that comes back to the sort of the desire for this to be about economics, right? Everybody wants this to be, a referendum on globalization. And if it's a referendum on globalization, then maybe Bernie was the guy. But it's not. There are so many deep-seated cultural things, and there's so many party-related things, and I don't think he was the guy. I mean, I like him and all, but.
James Serwicki in The New Yorker is your guy to read on this in terms of actually going to specific neighborhoods where people are saying this is about economics, and then looking at those voters, looking at the history of those districts and going, no, this is, even in this district, not about that.
Yeah. Perhaps one final question.
So a couple of months ago, there were a lot of articles kind of asking what does the Republican Party even stand for anymore, and it's sort of been taken over, and is it broken, and will it survive Trump? So I guess all those questions are sort of moot now, or maybe not. If Trump had lost last night, would you think that the Republican Party was in real danger? Is it still in real danger? Is it the two-party system in any way?
But I think a lot of people think that the fault with American politics is the two-party system, and there were a lot of protest voters out there voting for Stein and Johnson who were trying to have this be a referendum on the two-party system. But I think the thing to bear in mind about the sort of the American presidential race is that the parties are constantly morphing. They are extremely adept at changing to suit whatever they think the new base is about. And so it's not a two-party system in that there are fixed parties. It is a two-party system in that it is constantly reflecting the changing needs of the people. And so the Republican Party was never going to be over. It was just going to change its shape. And now it has changed its shape to be Trumpism plus some normal Republicans in Congress. I don't know.
And some evangelicals.
And whoever else is coalition building with
and
them.
I think, people like Dan sort gradually the other way.
Right, and so he's gonna he might still be a registered Republican, but he's going to migrate towards the Democratic Party. That's how
I do some thinking about that.
Yeah, but I have lots of friends who were registered Republicans.
Nice.
Who use this as an example. Yeah, use this as a breaking point.
Mostly.
So So I don't think either party is over. I think they're doing what they naturally do at presidential elections, which is reevaluate.
I don't know. I mean, on paper, last night was an amazing night for the Republicans. Like, they've got good majority in the House, they've got a narrow majority in the Senate, they have the presidency. I mean, I think a lot of it depends on how Trump intends. Well, how Trump eventually figure out what he intends to try to do about where, because there are so many breaking points between him and most of the Republicans in Congress, and if he tries to push those breaking points, I mean, I don't know. It'll be really interesting in not so amazing way. But I mean, I saw Paul Ryan was speaking just before Hillary conceded, just before I came here. And the words that were coming out of his mouth did not match the look on his face. He was talking about how excited he was, and he just looked ashen. And his demeanor was not the man of, not that of an excited person.
Like Boris Johnson after Brexit.
Yeah. So I think that dynamic and that, I mean, it would be a huge deal if Trump tried to sack Ryan. And I mean, it doesn't take, so the way the speakership election works is pretty soon they'll have an internal vote for the speaker. And then when the new Congress convenes, there's a vote of the Congress itself on a speaker, and all the Republicans are supposed to vote for the person that the Republican caucus picked, and all the Democrats are supposed to vote for the person the Democratic caucus picked. But there have been quite a few Republicans who would vote against a Ryan speakership if Trump told them to. And whether or not he wants to pull that trigger, I hope he, I don't know. I don't even know. But that'll be something to watch for in the next couple of months, is that developing relationship. So, because it was also interesting to hear, like there were lots of notes of caution as Ryan was speaking, and he was talking about the Republican House agenda that he had set out and how that had been endorsed. And there's gonna be a complicated dance, which Trump, if he reverts to his usual subtlety, may not be a dance for very long. So.
Great. Well, I'm sure the post-mortem will go on for many months ahead, but our time is sadly up. I'd like to say thank you to the three speakers. I think, as Dan just said, I think it's having interesting times, but perhaps not in the most amazing way.
Yeah. Isn't that an old
They live in interesting times.
I think it's certainly going to be looking for a job. I think all the posters will probably be sacked tomorrow, so that's something to consider. So thank you once again to our three speakers. It's been really interesting, and these have been interesting times. Thank you.